way, I'm really glad to have Linda Nagel with us and Brian Palik as well. The two of them are going to be talking about operationalizing adaptive silviculture for climate change in Minnesota. Linda is a former faculty member at Michigan Tech and the University of Minnesota, former director of the Cloquet Forestry Center. She's now out as professor and department head of forest and rangeland stewardship out at Colorado State. And Linda, it's just wonderful to have you back. We're going to hear from Linda for a little bit, and then we'll take questions. Then we'll hear from Brian Palik. Brian is another familiar name. He's with the Northern Research Station based in Grand Rapids. And I'll remind you before we begin of a couple of quick things. If you're here for continuing ed credits, watch for the continuing education credit link right at the end of the webinar. You'll need to use that to enter your name and email address to get credits. I'll also share a link to a feedback form. And of course, I am recording the presentation, and the recording will be made available on our website, the same page that you used to register for this event, as soon as I can get it there. Our webinars are offered by a partnership between the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative based at the Cloquet Forestry Center and the University of Minnesota Extension Forestry Program. We're glad to be working together to bring these to you. And with that, Linda, welcome again. You are muted right now, but you're on as soon as you're ready to go.
Excellent. Eli, can you hear me?
Yes, when I'm not muted, yes, you're just fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and present. It's great to be back with the SFEC. And on behalf of Brian and myself, I just want to thank you for attending this webinar. I know we're all spending a lot of time behind our computers, behind Zoom and Teams and all kinds of other platforms. And I have found that the days where I can sit and enjoy a lecture or a seminar are some of the more enjoyable times that I'm spending behind my computer. So thanks for joining us today. We hope that you find something interesting in our talk. Many of you are going to be familiar with this work and have probably heard either Brian or myself or others talk about the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. And so our plan here is to tag team. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the broader network and the framework for how we have developed this project. And then I'll hand it over to Brian, and he'll talk more specifically about how we have applied this here in the state of Minnesota. Even though I say here, I'm actually sitting in Colorado and Brian's sitting in Minnesota, but we'll talk more broadly too about how we've applied this to other contexts. So, let's see. Okay, whoops. There we go. Okay, so this slide here shows the current network as it is. We started this project about 10 years ago when actually the U.S. Forest Service came forward with identifying this need for how to apply climate change principles to silviculture and forest management on the ground. And there weren't very many examples, explicit examples of how to take this kind of theory around adaptation and apply it in a real world context. And so we began this project by thinking about the framework, and I'll talk a little bit about the different adaptation options that we utilize as part of this project in a few minutes. Our first site that we developed is on the Chippewa National Forest, on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest in Minnesota. And so it's exciting to talk about this site because it's the furthest along and it demonstrates a really nice spectrum of treatments in a very interesting context. And so the other points that are identified here on this map represent the other sites that we have. We have 7 sites, and I'll talk briefly about all 7 of those. And then the orange stars identify places where we have key scientists and thought leaders who contributed to the development of this framework. So at the national level, or now international level, because we have a couple of sites that we're developing in Canada, we lead this project with a partnership with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which many of you are also probably familiar with. Courtney Peterson is the coordinator for the network, and she's also a member of NIACS. Chris Swanston and Maria Genobiak are regional folks that you may be familiar with. And then Jim Goulden was the original PI from the Southern Research Station who came forward with some initial funding that helped us develop this project. this slide shows the site leads for each of the projects. And so this project is really all about teams and teams leading their sites and then coming together as a network so that we're strong individually at each of our individual sites, but we're even stronger as a network because we have developed and applied a consistent framework across different contexts. And so this is a combination here of both scientists and managers. And the Minnesota site is led by Brian Palik with a lot of other scientists and key managers on the Chippewa National Forest. And this work could not be possible without these strong partnerships between both research and the management community. So I just want to give a shout out to all those folks. And this slide represents leadership from the 7 different sites that we have currently existing in the network. So as I mentioned, this project became or emerged about 10 years ago with the basic question and need that forest managers need operational examples of how to integrate climate change adaptation principles into their practices and decision making. And so the overarching goal is really to foster resilience to the impacts of climate change and enable to adaptation of ecosystems to uncertain climate futures. And a key part of this project has also been training. So not just developing a research project and implementing it on the ground, but also training managers and professionals in that process. So the basic question is, what actions can be taken to enhance the ability of a system to cope with change and meet goals and objectives? So we use the framework that the NIACS group developed as part of their, what they often call the workbook process. And it's a basic adaptive management framework here, where we start with defining an area of interest. We assess the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for that area. And there's a lot of resources now available for different forest types and regions around vulnerability to climate change. The third step is we evaluate the management objectives and projected impacts and vulnerabilities. And here's where we start asking silvicultural questions, such as questions around desired future conditions and whether the notion of a desired future condition is still relevant or needs to be adjusted given what we understand about climate change and potential impacts. The fourth step is to identify and implement adaptation approaches and tactics. And here's the exciting part where we get to develop the silvicultural treatments. And then the fifth step, of course, is to monitor and evaluate effectiveness of those treatments, which then sort of completes that feedback loop, which is constantly revisited over time. So with this project, at each of the sites where we've developed an installation, we start first with a lot of conversation with a key scientist or scientists and a key manager or managers from that particular location. And we do a lot of pre-planning before we get to the point where we convene and conduct a collaborative workshop. And during the collaborative workshop, we do some training and tools, usually on the first day. And then the second and third days are really focused with a small group on developing the experimental design as it relates to that local context, the local forest type and the local issues that exist there. These pictures here on the left represent a workshop that we did in the Twin Cities last March in 2019. And so that's a group that we had convened, and we'd worked to develop some experimental treatments that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. There's a common design that applies to each of the sites that includes the 3 treatments and a control. So our treatments are resistance, resilience, and transition. We have minimum study design elements that are required to be part of the network. That includes number of replications. So each treatment is replicated 4 times. The stand size or experimental unit size is 20 to 25 acres as a minimum. And we ask each of the sites to commit to a monitoring plan and an evaluation window that allows us to collect data consistently and will eventually allow us to ask cross-site questions. And then there are site-specific components with each of the sites. So the forest ecosystem type, the context, the management concerns, the management objectives, the approaches, and then the final monitoring plan. So at the workshop, we really, and these pictures are from the Chippewa National Forest in 2013 when we developed the treatments. I think it was June of 2013. And so we do this collaborative process where we break out into groups and we do some thinking and creative problem solving. We come back together and we build consensus around a set of treatments. And for each of the treatments, resistance, resilience, and transition, we talk about what appropriate desired future conditions would be represented by those different treatments, what the management objectives would be that would be met by those treatments, and then how are we going to achieve both the experimental objective and the DFC through our silvicultural actions. This table represents kind of the basic parameters that and variables that we're interested in monitoring over time across all the sites. We're really focused on the vegetation, including the overstory, the midstory, and the ground layer. We are interested in the impacts of these treatments on forest health in the long term, and then overall sustainability and productivity. Along with that, each of the sites has additional specific questions that they're interested in given their forest type and the management context. So for instance, we have a lot of bird surveys that are taking place, some herb studies, additional understory vegetation, some physiology studies. So depending on the context and those that are involved, there's a lot of additional questions that are being asked. This is the basic plot design, and it is modeled after the FIA plot design. Originally, we had thought about deploying the FIA plot design, but it was too intensive for our purposes. But essentially, you can see that there's nested plots that are allowing us to measure the overstory vegetation, the midstory, and then understory vegetation. We also try to take hemispherical photographs and do some measurements and calculations about canopy cover and change over time. Okay, so let's talk for a brief minute about the 3 adaptation treatments that we are utilizing in this study. On one end of the spectrum, we have resistance, which is basically trying to keep the ecosystem the same as it is, so persisting over time. Here we're trying to improve the defenses of the forest against change, but like I said, maintaining unchanged conditions over time. And the issue with this particular treatment, or the risk with this treatment, is that we don't know exactly how climate change will impact ecosystems. And so you can see the trajectory there. It may require a significant amount of resources and effort to keep that ecosystem as it is today if we're not flexible in our approach. Resilience is a treatment or a concept that we talk a great deal about, not only ecologically, but especially today as we're undergoing this global crisis. We talk a lot about resilience and the basic notion of being able to bounce back after a disturbance or some type of change. And so that's the concept here, is that the treatments that we prescribe here and our ideas for the future are really trying to anticipate what change will come with climate change on different forest ecosystems, understanding those vulnerabilities, and creating a management approach that allows that ecosystem to bounce back or be flexible enough that it can withstand and be resilient to other disturbances into the future. So that future condition might look quite different from its current condition. And then the other end of the spectrum is what we're calling transition. And here we're actively managing for change. So ecosystems may be fundamentally different in the future. The species composition and the structure might be intentionally different. And we're really trying to actively facilitate an ecosystem response to future conditions. And so this treatment has really forced people to think very differently about future conditions and how we might create sustainable ecosystems into the future. Some of the core questions that we're asking across this network are both management related questions and research questions. So we're interested from a manager perspective in identifying which treatments over time are the most feasible, which ones achieve the desired future conditions to the best degree. Are there trends across the different sites as to which treatments perform the best? Thinking about those future conditions, does it make sense to change our notion of what a future condition might be? And then what are some of the trade-offs that exist around adaptation or adaptation objectives and meeting other multiple use objectives that a landowner might have? Some of the scientific questions are somewhat similar. We're interested in comparing the treatments across sites. What are the responses that we observe into the future? Do the treatments achieve the objectives that they were designed for? Are there certain criteria that help us determine whether a treatment was successful or not? And does one treatment consistently perform better across all sites? And these are both short-term and long-term research questions. So what I'm going to do now is very, very briefly walk you through the 7 sites that we have as part of the network. And if you have specific questions about these sites, I'd be happy to answer them toward the end of the webinar. But I think it's very constructive to look at different ecosystem types and how we've applied this framework given different contexts. Brian will talk in much more detail about the Cutfoot experimental forest site, so I'll do this one extremely briefly. This is a red pine dominated forest, and some of the climate change impacts that we're really concerned about here are largely related to drought and some forest health issues. Our resistance treatment is essentially, again, trying to keep the ecosystem the same, is essentially a uniform thinning that maintains red pine dominance. The resilience treatment is a regeneration cut that we're calling a variable density thinning. And here we're creating some heterogeneity across the site that will also promote different species into the future that we're focusing primarily on native species. And then the transition treatment is a much more aggressive silvicultural treatment that we're calling an irregular shelterwood, also producing a much more heterogeneous forest type or forest structure into the future. And here we're focusing on a different suite of species into the future that encompass both native and novel species. And Brian will unpack that for us in a little while. The San Juan National Forest was our second workshop that we conducted in 2014. And this particular site is slated to be harvested this summer. So it's been a little bit behind schedule from what we had originally planned. It's a warm, dry mixed conifer mid-elevation site that has some concerns over warming and also hydrological impacts such as changes in precipitation, earlier snowmelt, and the potential impact that will have on wildfire and insect outbreaks. So here, the resistance treatment is really addressing historic range of variability in terms of stand structure and disturbance regimes. And so the resistance treatment is basically a thinning with a priority for species retention, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and then white fir. The resilience treatment is focused on also a thinning, but a higher thinning, focusing on drought tolerant species and removing the white fir and retaining aspen. So here we're trying to create a clumpy multi-cohort structure that will be more resilient to potential wildfire into the future and will help us manage for that HRV. The transition treatment is really moving that ecosystem type to a less dense canopy, so a canopy openness of 30 to 40%, expanding existing gaps, and focusing on drought and fire tolerant species. Here, the group was willing to accept a reduced canopy cover, meaning that the forest ecosystem will look and function very, very differently into the future than it currently does, as you can see from the picture on the left. With the transition, they want to retain all ponderosa pine and aspen, and those are the 2 species of primary concern there. The next site I'll talk about is on the second college grant, which is part of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Tony D'Amato, who many of you know, is the primary site lead for that site, and he's also heavily engaged in the Minnesota site as well. This is a beautiful northern hardwood mixed stand. It's was approximately 2-aged with a reverse J-shaped diameter distribution. And it's dominated by sugar maple, beech, yellow birch, red maple, red spruce, aspen, and balsam fir. So here they were really interested in certain events such as wind and ice, as well as trying to create pathways for the future that allow for resilience to disturbances. So the resistance treatment for this group represents their business as usual management, which is basically uneven age management through the use of single tree selection. And so this is promoting multi-cohort structure and also focusing some on the hydrological cycle. The resilience treatment here is a combination of group and single tree selection. So we've got a combination of gaps, reserves, and thinning the matrix. And here we're really focusing on multiple pathways through natural regeneration. And then the transition treatment is a variable density thinning, similar to the transition treatment in Minnesota, in that we're also calling this an irregular shelter wood with gaps, reserves, and matrix. But the difference here is that we're focusing more on some offsite species that have been already planted, including northern red oak, bitternut hickory, eastern white pine, hemlock basswood, black birch, big-tooth aspen, and some chestnut. At the Jones Ecological Center in Georgia, we have a longleaf pine hardwood system. And so this system functions ecologically very different from all of our other systems. Their concerns really revolve around drought severity and extreme weather events. And it just so happens that one of our treatments got hit by a hurricane last year. And so this is the first site where we have a major disturbance, where we're able to see how well treatments are responding to a major disturbance from the region. Here, the resistance treatment involves retaining longleaf pine, removing all off-site pines and all oaks, and prescribed burning every 2 years. All treatments actually involve prescribed burning every 2 years. The resilience treatment is their business as usual, and it's focused on increasing heterogeneity, retaining upland and xeric oaks, and removing mesic oaks. And then the transition treatment is thinning down to a really significantly lower basal area, removing oaks and offsite pines, but planting turkey oaks and C4 grasses. And these are intended to help with prescribed burning. On the Flathead National Forest, this site is about half harvested at this point. It's a western large mixed conifer site that has 2 different blocks to it that are slightly different ages. And some of the climate concerns here are differences in precipitation patterns moving forward, earlier snowpack melt, and increased risk of wildfire. The resistance treatment is a uniform low thinning, favoring the retention of western larch. The resilience treatment is a group selection treatment, favoring western larch over western white pine over ponderosa pine. And here they're planting white pine and western larch. And the transition treatment is a combination of seed tree with reserves in groups. And they're really focusing on future adapted species, primarily fire adapted and drought adapted. And here they're planting ponderosa pine, which is a species that's not super present on that particular site. They're also planting from seed sources that are both lower and higher elevation. And so that's one element of this study that's really interesting, is how different genotypes will perform at this location. The Petawawa Research Forest is one of our newer sites that we did a workshop with this group last summer. And here, it's an interesting site in that it has some elements similar to our Minnesota site as well as our New Hampshire site. It's a combination of white pine and hardwood, white pine, red pine, and hardwoods. And some of their climate concerns are similar to some of our other northern sites: moisture stress, wildfire concerns, snow and ice storms, and fluctuating water tables. And this group, I'll just put these up here, they are concerned, although we might be changing this as we move forward, they were concerned about not including their business as usual as a control. And so we actually have 4 treatments that we're contemplating with this particular site. Their business as usual is a 2-cut shelter wood. Their resistance treatment is also a 2-cut shelter wood, but we're changing some of the parameters around the residual basal area and some of the things like timing. And so with their resistance, 1 year after site prep, they want to plant white pine and red pine from local and southern seed sources. The resilience treatment is an irregular shelter wood with expanding gaps. And here we're also planting species from seed zones that are reflecting future climate change. And then their transition treatment is really aggressive and was really challenging for this group to think about, and that is to clear cut and plant pines and oaks with both local and southern seed sources, including red pine, pitch pine, red oak, white oak, and chestnut. And so they were very deliberate in matching their treatments and their species mixes to what they felt would be very conducive to timber management into the future. So commercial thinning of those species and production into the future. The last site that I'll talk about is what we're calling the Crosby Farm site, which is part of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area in the Twin Cities. And this is an urban floodplain forest. And so it's a very different type of environment and context for us to develop a set of treatments. We're not able to replicate this site fully, given the layout of the natural area. And so this is our first full affiliate site that we've included as part of our network. Here we have concerns. Those of you who are familiar with the area, this area experiences significant flooding, and in fact was underwater when we did the workshop in March of last year. And so we couldn't visit the site as part of the workshop there, but concerns are fluctuations in the water table and flooding, heavier rain events, and increased drought stress for some species. So the resistance treatment here is to maintain closed canopy conditions of current species composition and to promote or enhance native regeneration, both native and planted. The resilience treatment is focused on promoting flood and drought tolerant species that are native to the Mississippi River corridor and to create gaps for regeneration, utilizing areas such as ash pockets where there might be emerald ash borer issues, and to create additional gaps for desirable species. And then the transition treatment is also focused on creating gaps and incorporating future adapted species with more deliberate southern genotypes and seed zones coming from Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri. And the species here that we're focusing on include silver maple from different seed zones, red maple, American sycamore, river birch, sweet gum, southern pin oak, northern pecan, and yellow poplar. And this group is actually planning a planting event here in the next few weeks as part of this study. So I just want to wrap up before handing this over to Brian, who will talk more in depth about the Minnesota site. This is a picture of the group of site leads from the first 5 sites. We convened our first and only ever full PI meeting in Fort Collins, Colorado in January of 2018. And it was a really great opportunity for us to get to know one another across the different sites and to also really focus on the strengths of this network. And the list on the right-hand side of this slide kind of captures why this network is important to the management community. It's a scientist and manager partnership. It's mission critical and ethically important research. We've developed this very scientifically robust study design that has this long-term component to it. It encourages stakeholder engagement from the very beginning through the process, and it puts adaptive management theory into practice. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Brian.
Linda, thank you. We had planned to do questions in between, but I'm going to suggest that we go straight to Brian. I am going to ask folks, if you have questions for Linda or for Brian, please don't wait. Please use the chat pod or the Q&A and input those questions. We really like to have those in advance so that we can move things along quickly. Again, questions for Linda or for Brian, anytime, please, in the Q&A or chat. Brian, you're on.
Okay, so I believe I've shared. Eli, can you hear me and see?
Yes, Brian, everything looks good.
Okay, so as Linda said, I'm going to focus on the northern Minnesota pine installation of ASK, and I'll point out that I'm sure Linda did, but I'll reiterate, this was the first one in the network, so we're quite a ways along. What I'll do is just give a little bit on context, what and why, and then delve into a little more detail on the project, and then some on results of what we've learned. So what, broadly speaking, it's the Laurentian Acadian northern pine woodland. It was important across the northern lake states. Here in Minnesota, maybe we had 1.5 million, approaching that, hectares. And of course, has red pine dominated, large white pine component, but importantly, a lot of other species occurred in that system naturally. And that'll be important as we're thinking about adaptation. These were woodlands, not really closed canopy forests, so variable open canopy. Again, important to keep in mind as we think about adaptation. And of course, the native ecosystem occurs on sandy, drought-prone soils. Again, important to keep in mind. So now that forest is greatly reduced in area here in Minnesota, maybe 250,000 hectares. oftentimes strongly red pine dominated in plantations or even in natural stands that are managed for red pine. Of course, very important economically, high value products that come out of it. And I would argue it's the iconic northern forest type in the lake states, those mixed pine systems. So why is there concern? Why do we even think there's a need to think about adaptation? Well, broadly, the state level, you've all seen this graphic. By the end of the century, under a high emission scenario, Minnesota summers like Kansas and winters like northern or southern Wisconsin. And Lee Frelich said recently in that Washington Post article, if you saw it, we already have one Kansas, don't need another one. So quantitatively, by the end of the century, under a high emissions scenario, we can be thinking about temperature increases like this for winter, for summer, so pretty substantial. Precipitation, a little more tricky, maybe annual average, maybe not a big change. And some people are actually showing that it's been increasing. But it's that summer growing season precip reduction that we're concerned about when you combine that with temperature. Particularly, so potential for increasing growing season drought, particularly concerning on drought prone soils where these pine systems grow. So, you know, that's the prediction, but I like to point out that changes have already occurred. This is the map from the Washington Post's ongoing series on the 2 degrees centigrade increase series of stories they've had. And this just shows the hotspots of temperature increase that's already happened. And of course, north central trending towards northeastern Minnesota is one of those spots. And you can see Itasca County there, just in Fahrenheit, 5-degree Fahrenheit increase over that time span from late 1800s to recently. So that's a concern. Why? Relative to pine systems? It's because where the oval is, that hotspot of change is where our pine system is. Okay, so kind of focusing on that pine system, the northern pine forest in north central Minnesota, and these predictions are different in different parts of the state. To the northeast in the Arrowhead, it's a little bit different, but in north central Minnesota, this is tree atlas modeling, just generalized. So a lot of those component species that occur in that ecosystem have a predicted reduction in habitat suitability. A few of them down at the bottom here have an increase or little change. So some changes predicted there. And with red pine in north central Minnesota, there is still a slight prediction of a slight reduction in habitat suitability, but it's more than that. So we think of red pine as being tree species is adapted to drought conditions or dry soils, but it is really responsive to growing season precipitation and drought. So we've looked at this in a few studies. And this shows basal area increment over time, and those red arrows are droughts, major droughts. And you can see that consistent dip in growth after those droughts. So it is impacted by that. But it's more than just suitability and how it grows. It's things like changes in pests, and this concern about mountain pine beetle coming in from the north, I think is something that we need to be concerned about. Increased browsing pressure from deer, changes in associated plants. It's not just the timber species or the pine, it's other culturally important plants, paper birch, blueberries. So what I argue is that what we argued from the onset is this is a major forest ecosystem on the brink of change. So potential change, maybe even to the point of loss of an iconic northern forest type as we know it, reduced economic vitality for timber industry, loss of culturally important forests and plants. And that's really then brings us to the ask questions that Linda outlined. So kind of paraphrasing, we ask, can we build resistance to change? Can we foster resilience? Or can we transition, or should we, to something new that's better adapted? And of course, that's what ask is trying to do. So focusing in on red pine ask, as we call it, it's on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest, on the Chippewa National Forest. You can see the footprint of it in this air photo. It's quite large. And a whole bunch of people involved now and recently, including several graduate students. I noticed a couple of them are online here watching this, and a couple other student projects getting up and going now. So operationally, 4 treatments, we'll talk about the details of those in just a minute. Each one is replicated 5 times. and they're 10 hectare, 25 acre units roughly. This was the largest in total, the largest timber sale in Chippewa National Forest history. So you can see the harvest volumes and the sale receipts, timber receipts, and a big planting effort as well. And the point of this is it was designed to be operational in scale and practice. As Linda pointed out, the whole idea here is to put operational scale adaptation examples on the ground for managers to learn from and try. So Linda had this slide. Here's the, in photo form, the 4 treatments again. I'm calling it passive, the no action treatment, resistance, resilience, transition. So for us, the current condition is really the passive treatment. So these are red pine dominated. It's all FDN 33A, if you know Minnesota's habitat guide or native plant community classification. These are natural origin, fire origin, and they're old trees, although it's pretty wide establishment window measured in decades, so they're not all that old. Fire excluded, overstocked, we would argue, so pushing 180 square feet on average. Really dense shrub layer, mostly hazel, as you can see, and then the suite of concerns about climate. So the passive treatment is we're following various aspects of that and just leaving it as is. And we go on to the resistance treatment. So the question is, can we build resistance to climate change, keeping the system relatively unchanged, particularly in composition? So the desired condition is to maintain red pine into the future. And the tactic is thinning, and it's thinning down to about 100, 120 square feet in the first entry, which has occurred. And we're planning a second one shortly, which will go down to probably about 80. And there, for us, there's no targeted regeneration activities in that treatment. And why that approach? Well, it's well-established red pine management. Foresters know how to thin, and they know why you thin, to accelerate growth of the remaining pines by freeing up growing space, right? But it so happens that you also increase that growth or enhance resistance of growth to drought. And we know that from related work on pine systems, on Cutfoot and on the Superior National Forest that Tony D'Amato and others and I have been working on. And this just shows that here. Our metrics for looking at this are resilience, which is basal area increment after a drought compared to before, and resistance, which is during the drought compared to before. And that's what's showing here, resilience, resistance relative to 2 major past droughts. We do this with tree rings, obviously. And the point here is that this is stocking in as relative stand densities. So lower stocking, higher. This is about 60 square feet. This is about 140. And the point here is that both resilience and resistance are higher at lower stocking. And we know this from several of these kinds of studies and with other tree species too. So evidence that these forests can be managed to mitigate drought stress with density management. That's resistance. Resilience kind of looks like this. Desired condition is to maintain red pine dominance, but just barely, starting to push it down towards maybe 50% and increase the abundance of native future adapted species, native being key. And as Linda mentioned, it's a variable density thinning. I would argue it's almost borderline variable retention harvesting because there is a big regeneration component. Skips, gaps, and thin matrix, and the matrix between the skips and gaps is thin, just like in the resistance treatment. And site prep was disc harrowing, which that's what the chip does in these systems, then regenerating native future adapted species. So why that approach? Well, it's aimed at restoration, composition and structure of FDN 33A specifically, resulting in a mixed species forest that's presumably better adapted to future climate by having some species that are likely to be okay and a structure that conveys greater resistance to drought. So in the resilience treatment, here's what we planted. And most of this is based on tree atlas modeling predictions. However, in north central Minnesota, jack pine isn't predicted, at least last time I checked, to have a reduction, or excuse me, to have an increase in habitat suitability. However, you know that jack pine is adapted to drought-prone soils, sandy soils. So kind of expert opinion on this was to include jack pine. It's got a local seed source. The hardwoods are southern Minnesota seed sources. And eastern white pine is, you know, the O'Connell seed orchard source that we all plant up here. So moving on here, that was resilience. Moving on to transition. Kind of looks like this for us. The desire is, can we transition, or the question, to something better adapted? So reducing red pine abundance a lot over time, and then increasing future adapted species, both native and novel. And the tactic there, as Linda pointed out, is irregular shelterwood with expanding gaps. We haven't expanded the gaps yet, but that's the plan for the future. 20% of the area in gaps, they're half acre, and thinning the matrix to a lower density than in the resistance treatment. Harrowing or site prepping the whole stands, in this case, where they can get to, and then planting future adapted species. And those future adapted species include both native and novel. We'll look at those in a minute. So why this approach? Well, it's aimed at responding to end of the century predictions, results in stands having a wide range of resource and microclimate environments to favor a range of species. And the goal ultimately is to keep forests on landscape long term. They may not be the forests that we started out with, but we want to have forests there. So in the transition treatment, these are the planted species. There's 3 groups of them here. So the native species include bur oak, red maple, white pine, northern red oak. Again, Tree Atlas predicts stable or increased habitat. The novel species include these 3 hardwoods from southeast Minnesota, or at least that's where the main population begins. Again, Tree Atlas predicts new habitat for these. Some of these are black cherries on the chip. It's in northern Minnesota now, but sporadically. But we call them novel. And then way novel is ponderosa pine. And we'll look at why that in a minute here. I can tell you, those of you that are involved with planting, this was quite the operation to get the planters to figure out how to plant all these species in ways that were sort of random. What I will point out is all 3 of these groups are forms of assisted migration. We're hearing way more about that, and that's why we asked Eli to ask this question about it, get some input on what people are thinking or doing. Forest assisted migration is sort of broken down into these 3 forms. The least kind of risky and least cause for concern is population expansion. And that's just moving the species within its current range, but maybe you're moving a genotype that's better adapted to something, in this case, drier, maybe warmer climate. So, but not outside of its range. And that I would argue is those 3. Range expansion is where you're actually moving the species or the genotype outside of its current range, but not too far. And that's what I would argue the case with those. And then ponderosa pine is an example of translocation of an exotic, where you're moving something a long ways. So the nearest native populations are in the Black Hills. So it is that. So oftentimes when we talk about this, we get this question, what are you thinking? Well, briefly, here's what we're thinking for ponderosa pine. So if the worst case scenario were to transpire and that habitat suitability declined to the point it wasn't regenerating well, wasn't growing well, but we want to keep a pine system on the landscape, what's a potential alternative? And so that's where it wasn't just out of the hat we pulled this. It was during several workshops and meetings and discussions. We settled on this. And one, it's a large statured pine. So, and it's fire adapted. And it's adapted to winter wet and summer dry, which are exactly the conditions that are predicted for northern Minnesota. And if you looked around, it's actually pretty widely planted, particularly on the western side of the state, but beginning in the central as a landscape on a windbreak tree. There's plantations of it north of Bemidji that we've looked at that look okay. And so the thought was that maybe it's socially and ecologically acceptable alternative to red pine. This photo on the right is actually on the Avenue of the Pines, Highway 46 north of Deer River. And for a couple decades, I drove by these trees. There's a lot of them actually, and thought they were red pine, but they're not, they're ponderosa. So it's there. And then the southern Minnesota hardwoods, really our argument is that the climate for them, at least in terms of temperature, is already in northern Minnesota. You can see that in the shifts in hardiness zones that we have, the USDA puts out. It's been southern Minnesota and northern Minnesota for a decade now. And our results suggest that. I'll show you some on survival here. So what are we studying in this work? Well, a whole range of things. I'm not going to go into all of these, but just a couple of them briefly, and you can look at that at your leisure on the recording of this. So just focusing on a couple things. We do have an effort looking at natural regeneration with the idea that there's some species that probably are going to be future adapted. This is work that Miranda Curzon and her student Louis Eichmann is pursuing out of Iowa State. And this just shows the relative abundance of species that I think you'd call it advanced regeneration. There's the size class there in the 4 treatments. And the point is that there's been an increase, not surprisingly, in all 3 treatments of regeneration. And one of the species that's responding, not surprisingly, is red maple. So we're seeing an increase in that. But also some of these other hardwoods, it's relative, but bur oak is increasing as well in the treatments. And so you can see that there. We have a big effort on following the planted tree regeneration, and this is work that Linda Nagel and her student Jacob Mueller, who's a graduate of Minnesota. He's now on faculty at University of Kentucky, and he did this work, and it's ongoing, but this is what was in his dissertation. So this is 3rd-year survival for the 10 species or seed sources that we planted. Ponderosa pine, there's actually 4 seed sources, a couple from South Dakota, 1 Montana, 1 Nebraska, and then the hardwoods, and then eastern white pine is right there. And the take home there is that there's really good survival for a lot of these species, including those southern Minnesota hardwoods. And not surprisingly, Ponderosa pine survival is, moderate, 50% or so at this time, and it's really sensitive to competition in the ground layer, shrub layer, and it doesn't do well where there's a lot of hazel and raspberry and bracken fern. So that's what you're seeing there. The flip side to survival is growth. So it's the same 10 species. And as is often the case, species that invest in survival don't grow quite as fast, and that's what you're seeing here. Whereas these species that don't invest as much in survival grow faster. So where it survives, Ponderosa pine grows pretty well. This is relative growth rate. It's not a direct measurement of size increase, but that's how you need to look at this stuff. Another thing that Jacob put a lot of time into was characterizing microclimate. The idea was to see how the treatments and the range of canopy conditions they create influence microclimate. These are the variables that he measured, and we still are measuring these. And here's just one example. This is soil temperature, mean, max, min, as a function of canopy openness. And the point here is that there's a pretty good relationship between canopy openness and soil temperature, but which probably isn't surprising. But the point is there's great opportunity to manipulate microclimate at this sort of plant level, microsite level by canopy manipulation. And that's kind of the idea there to how can we moderate harsh climate by doing that. I'll just mention this as well. I know Jamie was on too, I checked. So Jamie Mosel, student at University of Minnesota, is doing a really innovative study manipulating rainfall essentially in the study using rainfall exclosures. And this is example of one of her setups here. She got a number of them out there. And there's Jamie, and these troughs collect rainwater, assuming it ever rains here, and runs off the plot. I don't know if you can see that in the bottom are her planted seedlings. So she's looking at physiological responses to a number of the species that we've planted out there as a function of drought. So that's ongoing. I'm going to kind of finish off here by going back to the slide Linda showed, which is showing the range of adaptation options from managing to persistence to managing for change, from the resistance to transition, and those sort of the objectives on the bottom of each one. And what I like to do is put that in the context of these pine systems and talk to managers about what they can do, and recognizing not everybody can do all of these things. So for us, resistance is just simple as this. It's thinning. And it's easy, it's low risk. Foresters know how to do it. And we probably need to be doing more of it for the growth enhancement we get. But there's also this benefit of increasing resilience resistance to drought. So that's climate change adaptation. Then resilience for us is restoration. It's harder in that it's not just kind of standard red pine thinning and how we manage it, but you're trying to create a system that's within the natural range of variability. You should know how to do it. Cutting gaps, thinning between the gaps. And then of course there's transition, and arguably it's big, it's bold, it's new, It's high risk. It's not for everybody. We're doing this on experimental forest on an operational scale. Foresters need to know how to do this, and we probably need convincing to try it, but we argue strongly, as do all the people working in Ask and others, that now's the time. We can't wait 20 years or 50 years to start looking at this stuff. So I'll just finish off summarizing climate predictions. Northern Minnesota, warmer growing seasons, warmer, wetter winters. Changes in tree habitat and condition, they could be substantial, including radical change in that iconic pine forest. So the forest is vulnerable. It's overstocked. It's usually a single cohort. It's got a high fuel loading, overdominance by one species, this increased risk of pests and pathogens, particularly mountain pine beetle. Our treatments are meant to, again, be based on the available science, but designed to foster shorter term resistance, maybe mid-term resilience, but potentially the need for thinking longer term transitioning to something better adapted. And then I guess I would finish off by saying that these adaptation approaches can be operational, and they need to be. Treatments need to be realistic in scale, and ultimately they need to pay for themselves in terms of regeneration in particular. So I will say that if I've said something of value, probably one of these people said it first, all the people that are actively working on this. And then, as you can imagine, this is a huge effort. And these folks up here in our lab are the field support that pull this off. And then a whole bunch of organizations that provided money or logistic support to this. You see them there. So Eli, with that, I am done.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. And thanks, Linda, too. Those were both very interesting presentations. Big picture and then zooming into one location. We do have a couple of questions in the chat pod. I will ask anyone else that if you have other questions, go ahead and enter those at any time. The two questions we have so far. First is from somebody who's working on the North Shore in Two Harbors. She asked at first, just generally, what species would you recommend in Northeast Minnesota for native or novel species if I'd like to try resilience or transition? And I asked a little bit in response about the plant community or soils that they'd be planted into. And the response was that the hope is that people might plant them around Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center. So I would guess a variety of soil conditions. So Brian, why don't we start with you? Any recommendations or thoughts on that general question?
Yeah, I would say start going to look at some of the resources that are out there for this, like Tree Atlas predictions, which are actually the latest round or downscaled to different regions within a state. So you can look at northeastern Minnesota, which is a little bit different in terms of the predictions than north central Minnesota. Like I think it's showing red pine holding its own, or maybe even increasing in habitat suitability. I just got off of a, well, it was advanced silviculture training panel last week with someone working on the Superior, and they're looking at eastern white pine as sort of a logical conifer for that part of the world. Again, it depends on the soil type. So I would say that you need to look at some of the resources that are out there that help you hone in on your area.
Thanks, Brian. I did just put the URL for the Climate Change Tree Atlas into the chat, so you can see it there. A comment from Rick. Coincidentally, we're planting 230 conifer seedlings on our private woodland this week. 50 of them are ponderosa, and we'll be placing them in sites with a variety of exposure and moisture conditions. Very interested to see how well they do.
So Eli, can I just respond to that?
Yes.
I meant to say this, but didn't. We do not advocate planting ponderosa pine widely across the landscape. I know some of the press that this has gotten makes people think that, and some negative reactions to that. This is I'm glad that you're trying that. That's great, and I think we should. But I don't want you to interpret what I'm saying as Brian Palik says we need to start planting it everywhere. That's because we don't know for sure. There's enough evidence out there to suggest it can do okay, certain seed sources, but I'm not saying go whole hog on it.
Brian, you talked a little bit about the relationship between tree density, stand density, and resilience to drought in particular. Question following up on that is, will drought self-thin trees?
Well, certainly across the country and beyond, there's evidence of increasing rates of mortality related to climate change. I think the evidence is really strong out west, where the impacts are already a little bit more severe. We're seeing that. So in that sense, yes, I would say that we're going to see increasing rates of mortality of trees naturally. But do you really want that to happen? If you're talking commercial forestry, it's probably better to try to do that thinning yourself and capture that resource if you're working in that setting.
I'd like to pick up a little bit on a point that you made, Brian, and this might be one for either of you to answer. I thought it was very interesting hearing Linda talk about the different ask sites around the country. And there were some things that seemed very similar among sites and some things that were different, more or less unique to each site. And Brian just pointed out that, well, some of the things we're doing here, we're doing this in an experimental setting. It's not necessarily ready for operational deployment. And so thinking about all that, I wonder if you two have general recommendations or any thoughts for folks. We didn't get too many responses to the question about assisted migration. Of course, that's only one of many components we're talking about here, but any thoughts about parts of this that are ready for operation, to be put on the ground outside experimental settings, and how might a manager think about that? Obviously, it depends a lot on particular site conditions and a whole variety of things, but any thoughts about folks who are thinking, that's interesting experimentally, but what do I do as a manager?
Ryan, do you want to take it first, or you want me to go?
Go ahead, Linda.
Okay. Well, one of the, I think, filters that we use often when we're talking with managers generally about climate adaptive forest management is no regrets decisions. And a lot of the treatments, I mean, if you think about the suite of treatments that we talked about today, a lot of those are really sound silvicultural practices for lots of different types of objectives. And so I think there's a lot of space for us to work in and to make really good decisions. And one of the things that really excites me and continues to excite me about this project is just thinking creatively and differently about how we approach forest management, so that we don't just dismiss ideas right off the bat, but we might consider things that we wouldn't have considered before as we grow our understanding about climate change and potential impacts on ecosystems. So no regrets management or decisions, and just continuing to practice really good sound silviculture. As far as planting, I mean, that's one area where I think we think about forest development patterns. The stand initiation phase, or when we establish regeneration, is where we have the most control over species composition. And so the species we select and choose in this study will really help shape the future forests that we're managing. And tools like Tree Atlas, and there's some other tools like Seedware and additional tools coming online that help us gather information. They're not decision tools. They help us gather information to inform decisions that we'll make. And we're not, as Brian suggested, suggesting that we plant crazy species that don't exist on a current site, but rather these are experiments where we can test them. But we might consider southern seed zones, and we might consider a species that's really on the edge. And so, finding those places where we can kind of push the envelope in our creative silviculture practices is what I think a manager can take away from this and consider where you might not have considered it before.
Brian, anything to add?
Well, I would just add that this gradient of adaptation that Linda pointed out to, and our study is set up on, is just that. We're talking about 3 points on it, but foresters can be creative in terms of what they actually do and kind of mixing up aspects of one with the other. It's not all cut and dry. It has to be just like resistance, resilience, transition, as we laid out. So that's where the creativity of this comes into play, I think.
Well said. All right, well, we're at our time. I want to thank you both again for an excellent presentation. I really like it when we have a couple different speakers who complement one another so well. I like the big picture and then the way we got specific. Really a good talk today. I will remind viewers, if you would like to get a continuing education credit for watching this presentation, look in the chat for the link I just shared. With that, I think that concludes our presentation. Again, thank you, Linda. Thank you, Brian. Wonderful to have you both. I hope everybody out there stays safe and isn't too completely overwhelmed by Zoom or sick of it. I think this is a good example of how it can really bring us together in positive ways. So
Great.
thanks again to both of you and to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.